The explosion didn't wake me up. The silence afterward did. I was halfway through my first sip of burnt gas station coffee when my phone started vibrating off the counter. Missed calls. Unknown numbers. One voicemail after another. By the time I hit play on the third, I was already grabbing my keys. Ezra, you need to come home. Now. No explanation. Just panic. When I turned onto the gravel road leading to my property, the smell hit me first. Dust. Burnt rock. Something sharp in the air that didn't belong in the mountains. And then I saw it. Where my great-grandfather's dam had stood for a century, there was nothing. Just rubble. Hand-cut limestone blocks, some weighing more than a truck, were scattered like toys. The creek below roared louder than I'd ever heard it, free in a way it was never meant to be. And standing right at the edge of the destruction was a man in khaki shorts and a bright blue polo, smiling into his phone. Dexter Hawthorne, HOA president. He noticed me watching and waved. Actually waved. Like we were neighbors bumping into each other at the mailbox. Don't worry, he said, tucking his phone away. We took care of the problem. The problem. That problem was a dam built in 1924 by my great-grandfather and reinforced by 3 generations after him. A structure designed to control spring runoff from the mountains. A structure that had quietly protected the entire downstream valley, including Dexter's luxury subdivision, for decades. And now it was gone. Unpaid HOA fees, he added casually. We had the authority. Emergency action. Emergency. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because my brain refused to accept how insane that sentence was. Here's the part Dexter didn't know yet. I'm a hydraulic engineer. I design flood control systems for a living. Dams. Spillways. Watershed management. I know exactly what happens when you remove a 100-year-old control structure at the wrong time. And we were 6 weeks out from spring snowmelt. The dam didn't just hold back water. It staged it, released it slowly, safely. Without it, every ounce of meltwater from the upper basin had one destination: Dexter's neighborhood. But in that moment, none of that mattered to him. He was already explaining how the HOA had done me a favor. How my swamp lowered property values. How residents had complained about mosquitoes and the rustic aesthetic. Rustic. I knelt and picked up a chunk of limestone, still warm from the blast. Chisel marks were visible. My great-grandfather's hands had shaped this stone. My grandfather had repaired it after the flood of '58. My father had reinforced the spillway in the '90s. And an HOA board vote had erased it in one morning. That's when Dexter leaned closer and lowered his voice. You should be grateful, he said. We saved you the demolition costs. That was the moment I stopped arguing. Because people like Dexter don't understand warnings. They only understand consequences. As I drove away, I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call the county. I didn't even call my insurance. I opened my laptop and pulled up the snowpack data. And what I saw made my stomach drop. Because the mountains were holding more water than they had in 40 years. And now there was nothing standing in its way. Snow doesn't look dangerous when it's sitting still. That's the lie everyone believes. I pulled over on the side of the road, laptop balanced on the hood, cell signal flickering between one bar and none. Snowpack charts loaded slowly, line by line, like they knew they were about to ruin someone's day. 42% above average. That's what the basin was holding. Weeks of late storms. Cold nights. No gradual melt. Just pressure. Waiting. That dam wasn't decorative. It wasn't rustic. It was a throttle. A century-old safety valve that turned a violent spring release into a controlled flow. Without it, the creek would spike fast, angry, and wide. I zoomed out on the map. The HOA subdivision sat directly downstream, wrapped around the bend like a trophy. Big houses, finished basements, underground garages, retaining walls that assumed the creek would always behave. Assumed. Dexter's smiling face replayed in my head. Emergency action. Emergency for who? Back at the property, county trucks had already arrived, not for the explosion, but for the noise complaints. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so dangerous. An inspector in a reflective vest walked the debris field, clipboard out, asking me questions like I'd pulled the trigger myself. Did you authorize demolition? No. Any permits? None. Do you know who did? I pointed. Dexter stood near his SUV, arms crossed, chatting with two board members like they were at a barbecue. He didn't even look nervous. Why would he? People like him live their entire lives believing rules only apply downward. The inspector frowned. HOA claims jurisdiction. Of course they did. I handed him a survey map older than the subdivision. Clear boundary lines. Clear ownership. No easements. No shared waterways. My dam was entirely on my land. He nodded slowly. We'll look into it. That phrase again. The professional stall. By the end of the afternoon, the HOA had already emailed the neighborhood. I got a forwarded copy from a homeowner I barely knew. Subject line: Community Safety Update. They called the dam an unauthorized structure. They called the explosion preventative maintenance. They called the exposed creek a future greenbelt opportunity. Greenbelt. No mention of flood risk. No engineering review. No hydrology study. Because if they admitted danger, they'd admit liability. That night I didn't sleep. I ran models instead. Worst-case scenarios. Median melt rates. Sudden temperature spikes. Rain-on-snow events. The results all pointed the same direction. Failure. Not maybe. Not if. When. I drafted a formal notice and sent it to the HOA board, the county, and the state water office. Calm. Professional. Factual. I explained exactly what removing the dam meant. What volume of water would move downstream. How fast. How high. I even attached maps showing which homes would flood first. Dexter replied within an hour. Thanks for your input, Ezra. Our legal counsel assures us there is no risk. Please refrain from spreading alarmist misinformation. Alarmist. 2 days later, the HOA sent me an invoice. Unauthorized water retention structure removal cleanup fee. $38,500. They were charging me for cleaning up the dam they blew up. That's when I realized this wasn't ignorance. It was strategy. If they could bury me in fees and paperwork long enough, spring would arrive, the water would come, and they'd point fingers anywhere but themselves. I drove through the subdivision that evening. Kids riding bikes, lawns freshly edged, real estate signs boasting creekside living, homeowners sipping wine on back decks, blissfully unaware that the creek they loved was about to turn into a freight train. I stopped at the lowest bridge and measured clearance. It wasn't enough. Not even close. As I stood there, watching water slide harmlessly under the concrete, my phone buzzed. A weather alert. Rapid warming trend forecasted. Rain expected at higher elevations. Snowmelt acceleration likely. I looked upstream. The mountains were about to let go. And the people who caused it were still posting victory photos. The rain started at midnight. Not the gentle kind. The heavy kind that sounds like gravel thrown at your roof. By 12:17 a.m., my phone lit up with the first stream gauge alert. The creek had jumped 8 inches in 40 minutes. That alone wouldn't scare most people. But I wasn't most people. I pulled on boots and drove down to the old dam site. Headlights cut through sheets of rain, illuminating water already chewing at the exposed bank. Without the stone spillway, the creek wasn't flowing anymore, it was hunting. Every minute it widened. At 1:03 a.m., the second alert hit. Another foot rise. I watched tree branches and chunks of soil rip loose and disappear downstream. This wasn't spring melt yet. This was the warm-up. I called the county emergency line. Explained the situation. Used the right words. Upstream control structure failure. Rapid hydrologic escalation. Downstream population at risk. They thanked me. And told me they'd monitor it. Monitor. At 2:10 a.m., I got the call from a homeowner in the HOA. You said this might happen, she whispered. The creak's touching our retaining wall. By 2:30 it was over the wall. I drove toward the subdivision, heart hammering, sirens starting to echo in the distance. Police cars blocked the lowest road. Water poured across asphalt like it had always owned it. Basements flooded first. Then garages. Then the creek jumped its banks entirely and turned streets into channels. Trash cans floated. Patio furniture slammed into mailboxes. Someone's luxury grill tipped and vanished. And still no evacuation order. Because HOAs don't like panic. I found Dexter at the clubhouse. Dry. Brightly lit. Board members huddled around a conference table, staring at phones. His polo shirt was spotless. This is not related to the dam, he said the moment he saw me. This is an act of God. I stared at him. Really stared. Acts of God don't use explosives, I said. He told me to leave. At 3:18 a.m., the creek hit the bridge. Water slammed into the supports like a battering ram. Concrete cracked. Rebar screamed. And then the span dropped 6 inches in one sickening lurch. That's when emergency management finally woke up. Sirens. Evacuation orders. Flashing lights reflected off brown water that now stretched across 3 blocks. I stood with soaked firefighters and watched as water climbed the siding of homes that had sold for nearly $1 million. Finished basements turned into swimming pools. SUVs bobbed like bath toys. And still, snow sat quietly in the mountains. This was rain alone. By sunrise, the HOA neighborhood looked like a war zone. Mud everywhere. Windows blown out. Insurance adjusters already arriving like vultures. Dexter was gone. No statements. No emails. No smug selfies. But his board-issued SUV sat half-submerged near the clubhouse, waterline just below the HOA logo on the door. By mid-morning, the county finally issued the words I'd been waiting for. Preventable infrastructure failure. They taped off the old dam site, took photos, collected fragments of blasted limestone like evidence at a crime scene. One investigator pulled me aside. Did you warn them? I handed him copies of my emails, my models, my maps. He didn't smile. They're going to have a very bad week. But as bad as the flooding was, I knew something worse was coming. Because this was just the appetizer. The snowpack hadn't even started melting yet. And now the HOA had proven, on record, that they ignored expert warnings. Which meant when the real water came, there would be nowhere left to hide. The cameras showed up before the water went down. News vans lined the edge of the subdivision, reporters standing knee-deep in mud, trying to explain how a routine HOA dispute turned into a flood emergency overnight. The phrase kept changing. First it was, unexpected weather. Then, aging infrastructure. Then, finally, questions about a destroyed dam. That last one stuck. Because once reporters learned the dam hadn't failed, but had been blown up, the story stopped being about rain and started being about responsibility. And HOAs hate responsibility. By noon, the county issued a formal cease and desist to the HOA. No more statements. No more directives. No more community updates. They were ordered to preserve all records related to the demolition. Every email. Every vote. Every invoice. That's when homeowners started knocking on my door. Not angry. Scared. They wanted to know why their basements were ruined. Why their insurance adjusters were asking uncomfortable questions. Why the phrase, unauthorized demolition, kept appearing in official reports. I told them the truth. About the dam. About the warnings. About the invoice. You could see the moment it clicked for them. The shift from confusion to betrayal. Because this wasn't just about water. It was about trust. That afternoon, Dexter finally resurfaced. On camera. Standing far from the flood zone, hair perfect, voice calm, he blamed legacy structures and private landowners unwilling to cooperate with community safety initiatives. That would have worked if he hadn't said it standing in front of a backdrop that still had muddy waterlines halfway up the houses. The reporter turned to me next. What do you think caused this? I kept it simple. When you remove a dam without engineering review, permits, or authority, water does what water always does. It takes the fastest path downhill. That clip went everywhere. By evening, the HOA's lawyer quit. Not fired. Quit. Cited irreconcilable differences. Which is lawyer speak for I'm not going down with this ship. Then the second blow hit. The State Water Office released their preliminary findings. The HOA had no jurisdiction over the dam. No emergency authority. No right to alter waterways. And worst of all, they had been explicitly warned. That turned negligence into something else. Criminal negligence. Homeowners demanded an emergency meeting. The clubhouse filled beyond capacity. Voices echoed. Accusations flew. Financial questions started piling up. Why did dues go up last year? Why were there demolition line items? Why was reserve funding moved into a legal defense account? Dexter didn't answer. Because he wasn't there. He emailed his resignation instead. One sentence. No apology. The board tried to calm everyone down. Promised transparency. Promised cooperation. But once people realize they've been lied to, promises stop working. The county announced a full investigation. Insurance companies started denying claims, citing man-made causation. And suddenly, the HOA wasn't just dealing with angry homeowners. They were staring down millions in liability. I returned to the old dam site that night. The creek roared unchecked, carving deeper scars into the earth. I imagined what my great-grandfather would have said. Probably nothing. He believed in letting consequences speak. Up in the mountains, temperatures were rising fast. The snowpack was beginning to sweat. And this time, there would be no excuses left. Because everyone now knew exactly who pulled the plug. The snowmelt didn't rush in. It waited. For a week, temperatures climbed just enough to soften the pack without releasing it. Every morning, I checked the gauges. Every afternoon, the creek ran a little faster, a little higher, like it was inhaling. Meanwhile, the HOA was imploding. Homeowners demanded access to records. Board members resigned in pairs. Emergency assessments were proposed, then shouted down. People who'd never attended a meeting in their lives were suddenly reading bylaws like survival manuals. And buried deep in those documents was the detail that sealed everything. The HOA's insurance policy. It excluded coverage for intentional act. Explosives count. So did ignoring formal engineering warnings. That meant every flooded home, every destroyed foundation, every ruined basement, wasn't an insurance problem. It was an HOA problem. And HOAs don't have that kind of money. Dexter's name started appearing in emails in all caps. Lawsuits formed overnight. Group chats turned into war rooms. Someone leaked the demolition invoice, the one they'd sent me, to the press. The headline wrote itself. HOA charges landowner for dam they illegally blew up. That was the day the second storm hit. Warm rain. Heavy. Persistent. Exactly the kind that melts snow fast. By midnight, the creek gauge numbers were jumping like a heart monitor during a panic attack. This time, emergency services didn't hesitate. Evacuation orders went out before the water crested. Roads closed. Bridges monitored. Helicopters circled. It didn't matter. Without the dam, the basin released decades of stored winter energy in one violent push. The creek turned into a river. The river turned into a wall. Homes already weakened by the first flood didn't stand a chance. Retaining walls collapsed. Backyards vanished. A row of houses nearest the bend simply slid, slowly, horribly, into the water. And then came the image that ended the HOA. The drone footage. Aerial video of the neighborhood submerged, with the old dam site highlighted upstream. A red circle marking where the structure once stood. The caption read, "Preventable." By morning, state officials announced formal charges. Not against the HOA as an entity, but against individuals. Dexter's name was first. Unauthorized use of explosives. Environmental destruction. Reckless endangerment. The remaining board members tried to distance themselves, claimed they'd trusted leadership, claimed they didn't understand the risk. But the emails said otherwise. The warnings were time-stamped. The votes were recorded. The decision was unanimous. I watched the water recede days later, leaving behind a neighborhood that looked like it had aged 50 years overnight. Mudlines, broken windows, lives rearranged by a decision made in a conference room. At the dam site, state engineers surveyed the damage. One of them turned to me. "You were right," he said quietly. "About all of it." I didn't feel victorious, just tired. Because this wasn't revenge. It was gravity. And gravity always collects what it's owed. The arrests didn't happen with sirens. They never do. Dexter Hawthorne was taken in on a quiet Wednesday morning, leaving a rental townhouse 3 counties away. No HOA SUV. No polo shirt. Just a windbreaker and a manila folder clutched a little too tight. By then, the HOA was already finished. Bank accounts frozen. Authority suspended. Emergency management installed an external administrator to handle what was left. Homeowners received letters explaining what the HOA couldn't do anymore. Collect dues. Issue fines. Enforce anything. Because it no longer existed in any meaningful way. Civil suits piled up fast. Families who lost everything. Insurance companies seeking reimbursement. The county filing for environmental remediation. The state pursuing criminal penalties. Dexter's defense tried one last angle. They argued the dam was unsafe, that it posed a risk, that destroying it was an act of community protection. The prosecutor's response was simple. If it was unsafe, why wasn't it reported? Why wasn't the county notified? Why was it destroyed before inspection? Silence. Experts testified. Hydrologists, structural engineers, environmental specialists. Every one of them said the same thing. The dam wasn't failing. It was functioning exactly as designed. The phrase engineered negligence entered the record. That phrase followed Dexter everywhere. He pleaded out. No trial. No speeches. No redemption arc. Probation. Fines. Restitution that would follow him for decades. The HOA dissolved quietly 3 months later. Assets liquidated. The clubhouse sold. Proceeds divided among creditors who were still millions short. The neighborhood survived, but changed. For sale signs never came down. Values dropped. People moved away not because of water, but because of trust. I rebuilt the dam. Not exactly as it was, but stronger. Modern reinforcement hidden inside the old limestone shell. State approved. Professionally documented. Monitored. When the next spring came, the creek behaved. Water rose. Paused. Released. Like it always should have. One afternoon, I found a kid skipping stones near the spillway. His dad apologized, said they'd just moved in and didn't know if it was allowed. I smiled. Water's for everyone, I said. Control isn't. He didn't understand. But someday he will. Because this wasn't just an HOA story. It was a lesson. Power without knowledge is dangerous. Authority without accountability is worse. And rules written by people who don't understand consequences always fail the moment reality shows up. There was just one thing left. The final letter. The letter arrived 6 months later. No return address. Just my name, typed slightly off-center. Inside was a single page, creased, unsigned, and heavy with everything it didn't say. It was from the homeowners. Not the HOA. What was left of the community. They weren't asking for forgiveness. They weren't making excuses. They were acknowledging something most organizations never do. That they'd confused authority with wisdom. They wrote about how easy it was to trust someone confident. Someone who spoke in absolute. Someone who promised protection without understanding the cost. They wrote about meetings they skipped. Questions they didn't ask. Warnings they dismissed because they came from outside the bubble. And they thanked me. Not for fighting. But for documenting. Because without records there would have been denials. Without warnings, there would have been excuses. Without data, there would have been no accountability. At the bottom, someone had handwritten a sentence: "We won't let this happen again." I folded the letter and walked down to the dam. The water was calm that morning. Sunlight cut across the surface in clean lines. The spillway whispered the way it was meant to. Controlled. Patient. A century ago, my great-grandfather built this thing because he understood something simple. Nature doesn't negotiate. It responds. HOAs don't understand land. They understand forms. And when forms collide with physics, physics always wins. I mounted a small plaque near the spillway. No names. No blame. Just a date and a line of text. Preserved by foresight. Rebuilt after ignorance. People still ask me if I regret not stopping them sooner. If I should have sued earlier. If I could have prevented the damage. Maybe. But the truth is, warnings only work on people willing to listen. This story isn't about floods. It's about boundaries. Legal ones. Natural ones. And the dangerous moment when someone decides neither applies to them. So if you live near an HOA, if someone with a clipboard tells you they know better than the land itself, if you're ever pressured to just comply for the sake of peace, remember this: control without understanding is just destruction with paperwork. And water? Water keeps receipt.